couple of things to start with. Is this okay? The fact that you're here suggests that it is, but I want to verify. This is like being an exit row of an airplane. Like, are you okay with this with this day and time?
I am, yes.
Aviana? You're really quiet, soft. I can barely hear you, Aviana. I will also say that my I'll say it, my preference is that when we meet, we have our cameras on, but I am sensitive to the fact that there are reasons why people sometimes don't have their cameras on. I'm okay with that, but it will add to the experience if people have their cameras on. So it's not a requirement. I'm not going to think badly of you, but if you're okay with it, and in the future, if you're okay with it, that would be good. I can tell you that it has been, I've had a number of meetings with students over the past week or so, or the past 5 days or so. And I can tell you that having that connection has been really good and useful, right? For me as much as anybody. So, um, and it makes me yearn for next fall when we'll be able to be back together. All right. So we need to do I need to ask some other questions. So we just need to take care of some housekeeping stuff here. So one was the time and day. I'm willing to meet as many weeks as it takes for you to get comfortable with where things are, where you're at. We need to set up a schedule in terms of material and what chapters we're going to cover. I'll talk a little bit about that today. And I need to ask you, so presumably you have been in Blackboard. I just want to verify that you have access to the Blackboard course shell from last semester. I can't get you in the current semester's course shell. It's just the way it yeah, it's just the way it works. I talked to Tracy Lewis about this she's the person that oversees that. And so what we'll need to do, let me put it that way. So there are two ways that we could do this. So you have access to the videos. I'll go back and look again. I'm actually embedded in that course as well, from last semester, as an instructor. And so I'll verify, but I think you have access, and you can tell me this from last semester, you have access to all the videos that I had up for all the chapters, right? Even when last semester?
I believe that's correct. Last time I checked.
I believe that's correct too. Because I'll make reference in general to those, but I think you have access to all of that. So that I don't think is an issue. But this semester I have been adding to those videos in the following way. So each week I create a video literally that goes into the e-text. That's what's on the screen. And I go through section by section in a chapter to point out this is A, this is how things are connected in this chapter, and B, this is the stuff you should pay attention to in this chapter. And I do it with the actual book on the screen because I want to drive students into the text rather than just talking about it or rather than some PowerPoint slides or that sort of thing. I literally want to point out in the textbook where it's at. So those are not in last semester. That's not in the stuff that you have access to. So I could create those, and maybe that's what I'll do. I will see one. I have to think about this. I could create stuff in that course shell and I could add those videos there, right? Or I'm thinking as I've thought about this before, but I'm sort of rethinking this in my head as I'm talking. Or I can just I can create on OneDrive and Google Drive, whatever, either one, a space where you'd have access to those videos. Or I could just create a Google Doc actually, because they're just links to YouTube videos, right? They're on YouTube, but they're unlisted. I'm not sure yet. So my prior was to say I'll create a Google Doc and give you access to that, and that's we can kind of put stuff in like that. And the stuff there means a link to those videos, right? So things that are not current in that Blackboard course shell from last semester that are there for students this semester, right? That's what I'm talking about, because I don't want you to not have access to that. Is my point, right? What's your preference on that, or do you have one? So sorry. So I could create a Google Doc and just put those links in there for each one as and just put them there, right? Or I can actually copy those over to that other course shell. It'd be easier for me just creating a Google Doc and putting those links in there. But that work for you?
Yeah, Google Doc is fine as long as it's somewhat organized. Like if you have what's the word I'm looking for, like a title above what the video.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Absolutely. There'd be a heading of stuff and then chapter one reading overview and whatever. Yeah. And then the link. Yeah. And then chapter two, etc. Yep. It just means that you have to, what it means for, it's easier. It's a little bit easier because it's all in just in one document. It's all right there. As opposed to you have to say, well, yeah, the videos are there for chapter 3, let's say, right? Currently, but that reading overview for chapter 3, the chapter overview is not there, right? It's going to be over here on. So what would make it easier for me is not trying to add and build out that Blackboard shell more, right, from last semester. But if you said like, yeah, that would really, really be helpful, like I can do that. I can do it that way. But it just means you have 2 places to go then, rather than all being there. Although I can put the Google Doc link in there in Blackboard too. Well, that's probably what I'll do, unless you tell me like differently. Okay. So I need you to verify that you can get in, that you have access to the Blackboard shell from last semester. I think you do, right? The other part is I need you to verify, like I said in the email, do you have access to the e-text? So there should be a link in there. She used my setup generally. She may have turned some things off or this or that because she didn't do things exactly the way I did, which is fine. But there should be a link in there, I believe, to go to the text book. So I assume that's what you're doing, Calvin. It looks like that's what you're doing. Yeah.
Yes, it is. I'm just pulling it up right now.
Yeah. To just verify for me. If that's a problem, I talk with the Pearson rep, and I have before, so it's not a problem, but I just need to know whether I need to. I think you should be able to get access to it directly, but
Yes, I do. And if I don't, I have the physical textbooks as well. So.
okay. But it brings up the site, the Pearson site. You still have access to the MyLab site via Blackboard, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you should have that. You should have that as well. Yeah. Then, so those are things. Those are kind of just the sort of base stuff that I need to make sure that. Sorry, I'm here in the office. I thought I heard somebody knocking, but I don't see anybody. Okay, the door is locked out there. Okay. So you last fall did this is a question. It's going to sound like a statement, but I need to know this because we're going to talk about what we need to do to go forward. So last fall, you essentially went through chapter 4. Yes, sort of.
I can check.
I mean, at one point, I'm in the class, so I could see what was graded. I could see, well, obviously, and I said that to you last December already, but I'm not saying that that's where we're going to start. So that wasn't my point. I just want to know that you had some. We're going to start from the beginning, right? But you had some familiar. I need to know sort of where you're at. That's not exactly right because I kind of know that, but okay, let me ask it this way. Let me ask both of you this way, and I just need you to be real. I just need you to keep it real. So, should we start assuming that you know nothing from this class? I just need you to keep it real. And if the answer is no, that's fine. But then I need to know. That's the part I need to know. But if you said yes, then like, well, okay. I just need to know. I just need to know not just where to start, because I'm going to go back and start from the beginning, but how quickly we can do some of the early stuff versus, or whether I should just assume like, okay, no, we're just going to go recreate sort of in a linear kind of way.
I would go with the assumption that we really only know chapter 1, simply because that would more or less just be a review from introduction to macro.
Yeah, that's right. So chapter 1 is just not. I don't need to go through that with you. That's not going to be much. That's not going to be an efficient use of our time. Chapter 1, no. So that didn't sound good. You can that part. There's nothing in there that you can't just read. All right. So I'll make reference to that along the way at different times in different ways. But chapter 2 starts the meat of things. So here's the deal. So Aviana, I just need to hear from you. So assume that you don't know anything. I should start assuming that you didn't learn anything. Is that correct? It's okay. It's okay. It's not,
Yeah.
well, it's not okay, but it's okay. And it is what it is at this point. That's why we're doing this. All right. That's the point. So
For me,
what's
I was
that?
gonna say for me, it's some stuff that like I know, but it's not something that's like that was fully retained.
Yeah. Yep. And as we're going through things, if there's some things that you said like, yeah, like we're good on this, like then just that we need to have a structured but informal kind of process here. Right. So I just need it's going to be like class, kinda, but I don't know, but it's not kinda, right? I want it to be like doing a discussion session and doing a review sessions or this sort of thing, even though it's learning stuff too. But I want things to, you need to be you need to not just listen. That's what I'm getting at in this process. So part of what that means is part of signing up for this, part of the deal is on your part is like, yeah, I gotta read beforehand, just like as a class in that sense. I need to know what the hell's going on before I come. Not fully, but I need to know what's going on. I can't just show up and just like be, okay, just talk to me, Dr. Simpkins. It can be that way, kind of. But I need to have feedback from you. Say like, yeah, I'm not really getting this, or yeah, this part's okay, right? if we want to do this efficiently and effectively, right? You need to do some preparation beforehand, and we'll learn what that as we go along here, exactly what that means, how that works. So we'll learn that together, kind of what that means. Okay. So here are the I'm trying to, yeah, I'm gonna turn my document camera on and share. That might be the easiest way. Okay, so and I've got it over here, so that's why you're seeing me on the side of my head right now. Maybe I'll turn the other camera on. Okay. All right. So along the way, I need you to know what's working for you and what's not working for you, and the best way to go as we go. And if what I'm doing is like, yeah, that's good, or no, slow down, speed up, or like, no, we need to do this a little differently, that I just need to know that we can be flexible about that. So here's what we need to cover. Chapter 2. And I'm gonna get, so what I'm gonna use this time for today, because you're not all coming prepared probably for having read, say, chapter 2, because we didn't know what we're gonna do. What I want to do is lay out kind of what we need to do, what we need to do for to meet next week, and what I expect from you, and we can kind of work on this together. So chapter 2 is about measuring things in the economy, measuring real GDP, the price level, inflation, real interest rate. So it's about measuring stuff in the economy. So measuring economic activity. So the point about chapter 2, which kind of stands alone, I'm going to put a line there. So chapter 1 is this intro. There's some useful things in there, especially toward the last part where it talks about classical and Keynesian economics. In particular, those last couple of sections. Maybe it's the last section.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to be seeing what you're writing?
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry.
I remember you telling me about that.
No, I am sorry. I am sorry about that. This happens. I sort of really get going on the economics, and then I'm realizing, like, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry about that. All right. Yes is the answer to that. Wow. Okay. I hate that. Sorry. It's like people saying you're muted when you're on Zoom. It's like this old person thing or something. It's not. Other students do it too, but other people do it too, but it reminds me of that. So anyway, I'm sorry. Let me restart that. So what I want to do here is I want to lay out kind of what it is that we need to do. And then we can think about exactly how we're going to do it and the pace that we're going to do it. So this is also going to give you an overview of the kind of the whole structure of what we're doing in this course. So chapter 1 is a useful introduction, right? But that is it's exactly what it is. So it's useful rereading that, but I wouldn't spend endless hours on that. And in particular, the last part of that chapter, when it talks about classical and Keynesian economics, I'm going to draw a big arrow down here because that's going to come back down here and again at the end. Chapter 2 is by itself sort of a foundational chapter. How do we measure things in economics? Why do we talk about real versus nominal GDP? Why do we talk about real interest rates? And what do real interest rates mean? How do we measure inflation in the economy? right? These are things, these are economic variables that we care about and that we want to use our models to try and explain. So we need to know what we're talking about. That's the purpose of that chapter. All right. Chapter 3 talks about the production function, the aggregate production function for the economy. So there we're talking about real GDP, which is Y, right, in terms of the letters, and also is related to employment and capital and technology. Total factor productivity, which we talk about is we use A for that. Okay. And we'll get to that one once we start talking about that. Oops, I'm sorry. Once we start talking about that chapter, it'll be clear what we're talking about there. So the production function and the labor market. Whenever you have a market, there's a price and a quantity. Something you learn in principles of economics. There's a price every time. There's always a price and a quantity on the axes. All right. So the labor market, the price is the real wage. The quantity is the level of employment. Okay. So there's a labor demand. There's a labor supply. Together, they determine the real wage and equilibrium level of employment. Once we know employment for a given level of capital, the production function tells us how much real GDP we can get. All right. So that is the first two parts of our macro model. All right. So I'll say A and B, the labor market and production function. That's how we determine in the long run what the level of output is. Big chapter. Chapter 4. The goods market. We got the labor market, the goods market, production function. I'll call this C. The goods market, in that market, it is demand for investment demand and desired saving. So this is saving, investment, and the real interest rate. That's what gets determined in that market. So now we have the real wage, we've got employment, we've got Y here, the real GDP. Now we have saving, investment, real interest rate. Saving is the other side of the consumption. We learn about consumption in chapter 2, because one of the ways we measure real GDP is consumption, spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Those are the 4 buckets for measuring economic activity. From the spending side, we can. So what we're doing in this course is we're developing a play. And the actors in the play are consumers and firms and the government, the federal government in particular, and other countries. Those are the 4 actors in our play. The 4 actors intersect on various stages. In the market for goods, so we have firms who are making profit maximizing decisions about how much capital to use. And we have individuals in the economy making decisions about how much to save, how much to consume, how much to save. Okay. And together, those 2 things determine the equilibrium, interest rate, saving, and investment. Those actors also intersect in the labor market. Labor market, firms are making profit maximizing decisions about how much labor to hire to maximize their profit. That's the labor demand. Labor supply has to do with decisions by individuals, labor suppliers, households, about how much leisure to consume. Leisure is a good, so we can think about it just like pizza or anything else, right? We can use the same microeconomics underneath that. So what's underneath our model are people making decisions, interacting in markets, and the interaction of those players, of those actors, determines the equilibrium price and quantity in that market. Equilibrium, real interest rate is the price in the goods market. Saving and investment are the quantities. The price in the labor market is the real wage. The quantity is the amount of employment. Right. So there's a method to all of this. All of these things are interconnected. They're not separate things. We're going to learn them separately, but then we're going to put them together. So chapter 5 is the goods market. No new model there, but it's in the open economy. In other words, we have this is the first place where we bring the actors from other countries in. Net exports up here, right? So you can see the actors up here in the measuring economic activity already, right? Households and individuals, that's consumption spending. Firms, that's investment spending. The government spending, and taxes as well, but government spending, we're just talking about spending right here, and other countries. Those are the 4 actors. Those are the 4 bins. But in our play, those are the 4 actors. So other countries interact with people in our, if we use US as the home country in this case, people in foreign countries interact with people in the US in the goods market. That's the stage that they operate on. And so we can use what we develop in chapter 4 and expand that to the world economy, not just the US economy. So in chapter 4, it's a closed economy, and chapter 5, it's open. So all we're doing actually is we make an assumption in chapter 4 that there are no net exports. There are no exports and imports. There's no interaction between countries. It's just a closed economy. And we open that, we undo that assumption in chapter 5. So we start simple and we build out from that. That's the point. That's the idea behind the models. What's the simplest way that we can represent what's going on in the economy? And then we can add other, we can reduce assumptions. We can add other more complexity to that as we go. So those two kind of go together. Chapter 6 talks about long run growth in the economy. Long run growth of what? Of real GDP. So that's going to go back to the stuff from chapter 3, because that's where real GDP gets introduced in our model, in this production function. Okay. So what are the determinants of long run growth in the economy? So what we'll be able to see from that is that depends on the growth rate in employment, the growth rate in capital, and the growth rate in this percent change, or growth rate in what we call total factor productivity, or A, in this production function. This production function, just to be clear, is right. It's Y equals A times F of N and K. Or we can even be more specific oftentimes, and we could say A times N to the 0.7, K to the 0.3. And we can talk about where those numbers come from when we get to chapter 6. But the fact that those are exponents with less than 1 has implications for what the shape of that production function looks like. Has implications for labor demand, what the labor demand curve looks like in the labor market, because we derive that from the production function. It's just the derivative, partial derivative actually, right, of Y with respect to N. But we'll talk about that. So you can see that if there's going to be long run economic growth in the economy, talking about how fast GDP is growing, percent change in Y, right? That depends on the things in the production function. A, which is total factor productivity, which amplifies any changes in employment and capital, right? Change in employment and change in capital long term, right? So those are the things that ultimately affect long run growth. And we can talk about, well, so how does fiscal policy, how we can ask a question. So how does a change in, how does the stimulus package that was just signed into law by the president affect long run growth? Even though that stimulus package was really aimed at short run growth, getting us back to full employment. And so right now, what the Biden administration is putting forward, and discussions, or the next thing, right, for the Biden administration, they've already been talking to Congress about this, but the next thing is to talk about an infrastructure package. So what does that mean? It means spending, increasing government spending for roads, bridges, ports, airports, broadband access. All those things are part of infrastructure in the economy. So we can ask a question, and our model can tell us the answer to this, or help us analyze it anyway. All right. Say, so how is that likely to affect long-run economic growth? Right. So how is that? And so we have to tie that back to N, K, or A in that case. So we can talk about that, and we can compare that to say, well, if we spend money on a stimulus package and send checks to people in the economy, which they're started doing already, right? This past weekend, versus spending money on infrastructure, which one's likely to have the biggest impact on long-run economic growth? And why should we even care about that? So we can talk about, in the beginning of chapter 6, there are examples in the textbook that talk about this, right? So even small changes in economic growth among countries over long periods of time, over a century, let's say, have huge implications for standards of living. So let me just put a finer point on that, that if our economy is growing, instead of growing at 3.5% or 3%, let's say growing at 3% per year versus 2% per year, in 100 years, it could mean the difference in those two situations of having 2 or 4 times the level of standard of living at 3.5% or 3% growth rather than 2% growth. Or flipping that around, the long run, we've had real GDP growth about 2%, and there's something called the rule of 70. We can use that. It means that real incomes have doubled about every generation. Standards of living have doubled about every generation. So your standard of living at the same point in time as your parents, on average, not individually, not specifically, is about double what it was for your parents. Your parents was double what it was for your grandparents. So yours is 4 times at the same age what it was as your grandparents. That's what compounding does. That's what economic growth, that's what we're talking about. If that slows down to 1% rather than 2%, instead of being 4 times your standard of living of your grandparents, it would only be 2 times the standard of living of your grandparents. And only be about just a slight, maybe not double, but maybe 1.5 times what your standard of living of your parents was. If it slows enough, not goes negative, but slows enough, right? One of the questions is your generation may be, and this is my kids too, my kids that are a little bit older, right? Our youngest is 28, 28 to 35, so they're a little bit older. But this is the first generation where standards of living may not double. They may not be that different than the current standard of living that we had when they were the same age. If that happens, that's a huge change. That's a huge change. That has not been the case in the past. Another way to think about this, why long we're not going to, and I'm pausing on this one because it really underlies everything in the first 6 chapters and in economics, period. Why does every US president, Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter, why do they want to promote economic growth and living standards? Well, one reason why, a key reason why, and they wouldn't say it, they don't say it explicitly, but they say it in different ways. But if think about the economy as a pie or pizza, right? If the pie is growing, if the pizza is growing every year, depending how fast the population is growing, if the pizza is growing faster than the population, everybody has the potential to get a bigger slice. Everyone has the potential to get a bigger slice. In other words, everyone has the potential to have more pizza to eat, to their standard of living to be better. If the pizza is not growing at all, it means that if I get more of the pizza, you get less. And if that happens, in countries where that happens, that's where military coups happen. That's where revolutions happen. That's where social unrest happens. And that's where economies go downhill, generally, right? It's disparities that drive that sort of thing. It's disparities like that drive militancy in the Middle East. That's part of it, right? Economic futures, economic opportunities. In other places, not as the Middle East, but could be anywhere. Could be in Myanmar. Could be in South America. It could be in other places as well. So issues about long-run economic growth are really important. One of the things that we don't generally talk about, I am this semester including this, and at the end of the semester, if you want to be part of that conversation, we can do that. That's not part of what we're going to focus on to get you sort of up to speed from what we normally would do. But I'm spending the last 3 weeks in the course this semester, and I haven't done it before, and I don't have the readings yet either exactly. I sort of know what I'm going to do. So I'm going to talk about differential impacts of COVID on the economy for different groups. We'll talk about economic mobility across generations, work by Raj Chetty, and issues like that have to do with inequality. Generally, in macroeconomics, in general, this is not completely true. We don't focus and haven't focused and don't focus on the distribution of real GDP. We focus on the economic growth, right? We talk about making the pie bigger. We don't talk about how big the individual slices are for different groups, right? That's just part of macroeconomics historically. Not completely, that's not completely true, but in the e-text, you won't see big discussion. There's not a lot of discussion about that. Partly in light of what's happened over the last year in the US and around the world. There's been a lot more discussion about that sort of thing. There's been discussion before too, but it's really come to the forefront. And so I'm including more of that in this course this semester. But we got to have the model to be able to sort of think about this generally beforehand. All right, so Chapter 7 adds another market called the asset market and the market for money. Right, so I'm going to put a D there, right? A, B, C, D. A, production function. B, labor market. C, goods market. D, asset market. That is our model. A plus B plus C plus D. That's our macro model. Chapter 9. This is where this is the end of the road for us. Chapter 9 puts all of that together in one graph. ISLM model, or two graphs: aggregate demand, aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. ISLM FE, full employment line, right? In the principles of macro course, you learn about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That we don't do all this other stuff. In this course, intermediate macro course, you learn that this comes from all the other stuff. It comes from consumers making decisions about how much labor to supply and how much to spend and save. It comes from firms making profit maximizing decisions about how much labor and how much capital to use in production. It comes from the production function that links those labor and capital decisions and equilibrium in those markets, equilibria in those markets, to technology to determine how much output is produced. All right. All those things come together in chapter 9. So chapter 8, what's chapter 8? There's one in between there, right? And that is an introduction to business cycles. Okay. So it's the behavior of all these things that we talked about in chapter 2: the real interest rate, real GDP, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, as well as real wages, employment, right? What's the behavior of those variables over time, right? So what we call the business cycle facts, right? Our model has to be able to explain how those things move over time. Either that or we don't, otherwise we got to make modifications and changes to our model. So the question ultimately in chapter 9, well, actually in chapters 10 and 11, is how well do the models that we develop, the model that were developed, how well does it explain the actual behavior of the economy? The real data, the actual real data from the, say, the US economy or any other market-based economy. And we'll find out, and the price levels in there too, inflation. And the short answer to that is, well, it explains most things pretty well, or we wouldn't be talking about this model, but doesn't explain all of them. And so there's still work to be done. Economists still doing work to try to make the model better explain the data. Kind of like meteorologists trying to get better models for the weather each day. So there's kind of an analogy here. So we have meteorologists who try to predict what's going to happen and explain what's happening day to day, hour to hour, in terms of the weather. That's like the short run. Those are like business cycles in economics. And then we also have people, climatologists, trying to use models to explain what's going to happen to the climate over a period of a decade or a century. That's like our long run model. So those are the chapters that we need to go through. That's how they connect. Out of these, chapters 3, chapter 4, right? Those are the heavy lifts. That's where that's where there's a lot going on in those chapters. Chapter 5 is an extension of chapter 4. Chapter 7's a new market, so there's stuff there too. And then chapter 9, that's where everything comes together. There's a lot going on there in chapter 9. So that's kind of where that's where we're headed to. This early stuff, chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 2, you know, we need to understand that, but it's chapters 3 and 4 that we really need to sort of put the heavy lifting in. And that will get us to a good place. All right. Let me say one other thing, and then let's think about together how we want to do that, and what I need you to do to be prepared accordingly to have the discussion. So if I were to, if we were face to face in class, I would probably do this on the very first day of. I do this on the very first day of class. I use Teams in class. I don't online. Because yeah. Anyway, it hasn't worked out as well. But I do that in face-to-face classes on campus. And so every day there's not me lecturing, it's doing some activity that's helping to illuminate the concepts. I can share some of those activities with you as a way for you to practice ahead of time before we talk, to help sort of not just read the chapter, in other words, so that you're actually doing something and see how it plays out. I can do that. But that very first day, I will typically have an activity. And I'll ask you to do this right now. This is not a big long activity. This is time. So these are years. This is like 2020. And I don't know, we could go back to say 1945-ish or so. And I'm going to put real GDP on this axis. Y is the letter we use in this textbook. And if I actually plotted data for real GDP year by year over that period of time, and you'll see that in chapter 2, I think, probably have a diagram, maybe even chapter 1, right? It would look something like that. I'm drawing that just generally. Okay. So what are two things? So how would you describe that? So this is that. So these are actual data points, right? So 1945, 46, 47, 48, whatever. This is actually not, correct. I'm not trying to do it actually what it is. In class I would actually do the data, right? But this works. So these are all different years. These are actual data points from the US economy. So this is US real GDP. We could use any developed country. We could use a graph from any one of them, wouldn't matter. What do you notice about that graph? What are things that you notice about that graph?
It's a positive correlation between real GDP and time.
What does that mean? So what does that mean? That's correct. And what does that mean?
It means that it's every year it's increasing, at least for most of the years.
So you just changed that. You changed that mid-sentence, and what you just changed mid-sentence matters actually. So generally, I'm going to rephrase that. There's an upward trend. Okay, is that fair enough? I don't want to put words in your mouth if you don't think that's right, right? What else do you notice about it? You kind of captured both things in one sentence, but what's the other thing? So it's an upward trend, right? And generally, it's going up over time. Generally, real GDP is going up over time. Actually, let's stop on that for a second. What does that mean? I mean, what does that mean in the real world?
That would mean that the quality of life is improving, provided the population is not going up faster than the rise
That's
in real
right.
GDP.
That's right. The standard of living as measured by real GDP anyway, right, is increasing. All right. So over time, right, we have cell phones today. They didn't have those 100 years ago, right? 150 years ago, we didn't have electricity, right? We didn't have, right? Over time, the standard of living has increased, right? This is just 1945, but people have done, economists have done this. We could go back to around 1000, year 1000 or so, been able to put together some data. It's a little iffier back then, but some data, right? People were keeping track of things in the Roman Empire, for example, and et cetera, at different points in time. Probably, maybe even going back BC, we could go back there and have some estimates. But and we could see that if we extended this way back, what we'd see is it would sort of take off. It's sort of like a hockey stick. It's flat for a long time, and it just takes off around 1900, 1800, somewhere in that area. All right. And we can actually explain that in terms of our economic model, why that is.
Right? The Industrial Revolution, right?
Yeah, exactly. Steam engines, trains, allowing factory production was a huge. So we can explain that in terms of changes in technology, right? In our production function model, we'll get to that. We're going to get to that. Okay, but it's in our production function. And so we're talking about standard of living. So over time, standard of living generally increases. So if that starts to flatten out, like I was saying before, so if it starts to flatten out, it means it's not growing as fast. The growth rate of real GDP, in other words, the growth rate of real GDP matters for standards of living over time. All right. So if the growth rates start to go down, this starts to flatten out. Does it actually decline? Not necessarily long term, but it doesn't increase as fast. You say, well, that's okay. It's cool, still growing. Yeah, but it means it has huge implications for. One way you can think about it is within a country over time. Another way you can think about it, and actually in chapter 6, this is what the table the beginning of the chapter illustrates this, and it's a typical way that it's done. It's done in Principles Texas way too. You can look at 1750, even 1850. So let's take 1850 or so, and you can see different countries sort of GDP, real GDP per capita per person, right? To take into the population, right? As you were just talking about, Calvin. Who would be the leaders in terms of real GDP per capita, in terms of standards of living at that time, back in 1800, 1850? It's not the US, right? It's Great Britain, right? It's Australia, those two in particular, right? And over the last 150, 170 years, those countries haven't grown as fast in terms of their real GDP growth as the US, but the difference is really small. It's like 3% versus 2.5%. And what's happened over that time is the US real GDP is significantly higher than GDP in the UK and Australia today, right? They've just leapfrogged, they've just reversed. Doesn't mean people in the UK and Australia are in bad shape or something, but it has big, that's what it means in terms of, so if China's growing at 6% a year and the US is growing at 3% a year, which is about what it's been, the question is whether China can continue to grow at that pace or not, right? And that's generally, as economies get more developed, they can't grow as fast, right? But that means that per capita real GDP. Now they got a lot more people too, so per capita matters here. But you would expect that over time that you might see a reversal of who's at the top of the heap in terms of standards of living, potentially. But even within a country, it matters for where you're at. So if we went back in time, and so what it would mean for you today, that instead of if we had grown faster over the last 50 years in the US, or even the last 30 years, it means that instead of a salary, I'm gonna just pick numbers here. Instead of graduating and getting a salary of $60,000, let's say, a year right now, instead of that, which might be, accurate number. Yeah, some people get more than that, some people get less than that, but let's say it's about $60,000. If we had grown faster, that starting salary might be 90,000 today. I mean, that's what that means. That's what it means. That's what it means in terms of reality. So you said, well, no, I'm good with 60. Well, okay, but that's what it means, right? So that's number one, upward trend, growth over time. What's the other thing you notice about this graph?
There are infrequent short periods of decline.
That's right. So sometimes it goes down. All right. Those are called business cycles. Macroeconomics, really simply put, it's about growth and business cycles. That's it. It's really simple, right? Conceptually, it's really simple, right? So, you can think about putting a nice kind of flat line, not flat, sorry, a smooth line through this all to get to the trend part. This is just to kind of measure the trend. And so let's say that trend is the amount of real GDP if we're at full employment. So the phrase we have for that is potential GDP, because we're not always at real GDP. We're not always at full employment, right? Right now, we're not at full employment in the US economy, right? So there are times when so what this line is the actual real GDP. That's the actual real GDP that we have in any given year. At times, right? So pick a year. So just pick this year one, right? We could look up and say, here's the actual GDP, and here's potential GDP. Here's the trend, long run trend, and we are, right? So there's the trend there. But I'll just put potential, and here's the actual, right? For that year. So we have what's called a GDP gap, a gap between the actual and the potential. So here's the other part of macroeconomics. So at times, and so what we want to be able to do is to explain, why does that happen? So why do we get below? Why aren't we always at full employment? Right? Our model can help us explain that. We also want to understand, well, what causes this line to grow over time, the trend line to grow over time? Why isn't it like this instead? Why isn't it higher or lower, right? Because generally we'd like it to be higher. Or we can ask the question, well, what could we do to make that growth rate? So it could be from today, and what could make that growth higher? Our potential real GDP higher. Because then presumably actual would kind of follow along suit. And so we'd still have business cycles, but we'd be at a higher level, a higher standard of living. So what can cause that? Our model can help us understand, our macro model. That's a question that we have. All right. So the economists try to figure out, the Congressional Budget Office tries to figure out, for example. So the other part of this has to do with, well, okay, sometimes we're actually below potential GDP. Sometimes we could be above it, actually, right? But if that's the case, it means the actual level of real GDP that we're producing is less than we could be producing. And if we were producing at potential GDP, that's more goods and services, that's more pizza, that's more cars, that's more whatever that people would have available. So we're losing out on that when the economy goes into a recession. Right? In the real world, these are the stories in the Wall Street Journal like every day, or New York Times or whatever, right? People that lost their jobs due to the coronavirus, right? And they can't afford as much stuff. They can't afford their mortgage, maybe even, or their rent payments, or enough food to eat, right? So that's a real loss of jobs, a real loss of output, a real loss of standard of living when the economy goes below what it could potentially produce. So one of the questions we ask is, well, is there anything that's going to cause real GDP to come back to its long run trend by itself? And the answer is yes. So we can ask about that. We got to wait kind of until chapter 7 and chapter 9 to really get the answer to that. But the answer is also, well, maybe not. So there's, what if the economy doesn't go back to full employment very quickly? So you can think about this as like the Great Depression, for example. That's not the right timing here. I know that, right? But there are times when we may have prolonged periods. In that case, a decade-long period where unemployment rates were double digit or so. And the economy was not getting back to full employment very quickly. Right. Well, in that case, maybe economic policy can help get us back to full employment, get us back to that long run trend, right? Push real GDP higher. Well, that's where fiscal policy comes in. That's by the government, and monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. So that's the role of fiscal and monetary policy generally, is to try and get the economy back to full employment, not to get it too far, because what we find out is that if you push the economy beyond full employment, you risk anyway, there's a real question about this these days, right? You risk inflation in that case. And having too much inflation is not a good thing. So too much unemployment when you're in recession, potential to have too much inflation, to have higher inflation if the economy gets beyond potential real GDP. And so in that case, there might be like the Federal Reserve raising interest rates to try and slow down the economy a bit, not to put it in a recession, but to slow down the growth, right? To get it back sort of on its long run path slowly, because that will help reduce inflation. So macroeconomic policy generally is to help us deal with deviations from the long run trend. That's not completely true, right? It's probably true for monetary policy, we can say that. Question is whether that helps or not. That there's research about that. We'll be talking about that by chapter 9. But fiscal policy can have different kinds of effects. So the fiscal policy that's in play right now, in terms of the stimulus package that was signed into law, similar to the stimulus package that was signed into law by President Trump. Both of them have exactly the same kinds of impact on the economy, and that's to try and push the economy back toward full employment. Pure and simple. That's what it's about. The question right now that that bill passed, and also during the Trump administration that passed as well, right? There were previous stimulus checks. The question right now is, should the federal government be involved in spending money to boost spending on, should the federal government be boosting spending on projects to increase and improve infrastructure in the US? That can have a double effect. That helps, that helps make more contracts and put people back to work, et cetera, but also has the potential to increase the long run economic growth of the economy. Spending more money on education, higher education, making college free for 4 years, for example. Those kinds of policies are aimed at shifting the long run trend of the economy. That's what they're about. It's human capital, building human capital in that case. So our model can, so my interest in the interest in macroeconomics is not just to have fun with models, and that's kind of like doing crossword puzzles, all right, and that's fun and interesting in a nerdy kind of way, but it's also to be able to link the models that we're learning to what's going on in the economy. That's what real economists do. So they make forecasts about the economy, right? They use data about the economy each month, right? That new data comes out to try and understand where are we at, what policies might we need. The Federal Reserve employs hundreds of PhD economists to try and forecast and make determination about what interest rates should be to help the economy get on its long run sort of glide path. Federal government's trying to make decisions. The Congress trying to make decisions about policy, about macroeconomic behavior, so that it can help get the economy to full employment and on its growth path as well, and increase its growth path in some cases, right? So that's kind of a nutshell of the whole economy, or the whole course, I should say, and the big picture here of what we're about. So it's important to understand that, I think, as opposed to getting in the weeds for each individual chapter, because now we can get in the weeds and we can always go back to the roadmap and think about where are we at, where is this, how does this fit? So my suggestion is that for next week, if we can focus on, say, chapters 2 and 3, we might take chapter. I'm plotting this out as I go here. Maybe chapters 4 and 5, chapters 6 and 7, and then 8 and 9. All right, that'd be 4 more weeks worth of stuff. We may find that I don't think we can go any faster than that, but we might find that we need to add another week on or something like that, and that's fine. No worries for me on that. I'm here to do whatever works for you. But that's kind of the schedule that I would see. So, questions about that, or comments, or what do you think? And I may have to take a phone call here in a couple of minutes, so we'll break off here soon. But does that seem reasonable to you?
I think so. So would you prefer for us to come to class like having read chapters 2 and 3?
Yes, 100%. Yes, 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 yes. And watch the videos. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And I can provide, like I said, I can provide you, homework and solutions. Like, not that you have to do the homework, but you can, but you can see. I will do that. I will do that anyway. So, because you need to see the kinds of questions and the level that it needs to be at. There are two reasons why you're here: just to learn the stuff, learn this, right? But also, if you are interested in this final exam, this comprehensive final exam, you need to understand sort of what level you need to know things at to do well on that, right? As well, right? I'm interested more in the first part, but the second part's important too, right? So I'll provide you with, you know, homework questions from these chapters and solutions to those as well as we go along here, so that you can link what's in the reading and the videos to that. You know, in real time, you would have been doing these homeworks, you know, along the way to help reinforce what you're learning. But, you know, and so I'll provide those to you. And if you want, you can, you know, you can work on the homeworks and not look at the solutions. So after you've done it, or you can do it, you can have them side by side. That's up to you. So you can do your own, you can figure out what works for you in that regard. Okay. So I'll have a regular, I'll have regular email conversation with you, right, weekly about this sort of thing. I'll set up this Google Doc. Yeah, I think that's, again, I think that's the way, I think that's just the way we'll do that. Yeah, that's going to be easiest. I'll set that up and I'll let you know when that happens. Maybe I'll just sorry, I'm thinking this through as I'm talking. Actually, we're a small enough group. I'll just use regular email. I could do it out of Blackboard. I could email out of Blackboard and do it that way. But no, I'll just email you. It's fine. Yeah, we'll just do it that way. All right. That's probably enough for today. Right? We're diminishing your returns to this sort of thing. So, yeah. So this is a pretty heavy. You know, this is a pretty fast pace through this stuff. So, I mean, just to go back to what you just said, yeah, it's going to be really important that otherwise we'll be on to the next things for the next week, right? And adding more knowledge. And so, well, man, I didn't have a chance to look back at the other stuff. So, yeah, you got to be up to date with what we're talking about. Otherwise, things will get behind in a big hurry. Right? This is like even more than like summer school. This is like on steroids, right? You know, so, but you can do it. You can do it, but depends how much you invest in it. And I'll make these videos available as well. Okay. All right. So, you know what you need. I will follow up with an email at some point. Might be tonight, might be tomorrow, but you already know what to do. Chapters 2 and 3. That's what you need to be doing for next week. I'll provide you with some additional a few extra resources. Like I said, the homeworks for those chapters that I have and solutions, and yeah, as well as the links to the videos, the summary videos for those chapters. And then you have the videos in Blackboard shell that you're in right now from last semester as well. Okay.
Before we go off, can I ask a burning question I've had about the actual content of the course?
Yep.
If looking at the Cobb-Douglas production function, does infrastructure spending go toward the capital stock or total factor productivity?
Yes.
Both?
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
You know, I would that question is an interesting one, and does I was just pondering how to respond to that, but to the extent that it just deals with K, right, and that's the Cobb-Douglas production function right there, right? To the extent that it does that, they're diminishing returns. That's the point of that exponent being less than 1. All right, if I graph that production function with K on the axis and Y and holding everything else constant, it looks like that. All right. The more K you get more output, you get boost to GDP, but the additional output you get, the additional boost you get is less and less the more capital you have with a fixed amount of employment and a fixed amount of technology, all right, or total factor productivity. But the point about that kind of the infrastructure, so repairing roads and bridges, laying new fiber, broadband, fiber access, dredging ports so that bigger container ships can come in, or whatever. Any and all of those things will actually have an impact on total factor productivity as well. In other words, it'll both increase capital and it will boost that. In fact, it'll do both.
And if you were to increase human capital, say by increasing the number of educated people, that'd be total factor productivity as well. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the way to think. So here's the way to think about that, right? So let's say there's increased education. So let's say you increase the average education level overall in the economy over time, because now you're making, I don't know, 2 years of college free or whatever. It could be a variety of different things, right? Loan forgiveness, maybe, or free loans, or I don't know, whatever, something like that. The idea there is the same amount of workers, right? The same N can now produce more GDP. So that's not really changing physical cap. It's not changing physical capital. You could think about this as human capital too. You could, in some model, so more sophisticated models in economics, people that do this economic growth work, they would actually break that out into human capital as well. So it's a more complicated answer to your question than I'm getting at. But for our simple purposes here, yes, that's going to, so the same amount of workers can produce more output with the same amount of workers, same amount of capital, can probably produce more workers if they have a new machine learning AI software, more people doing that kind of thing, right? For example, more training and that sort of thing. So that by default means A is increasing. There are more sophisticated models for this, and if you're in graduate school, you would do more sophisticated models that could break that out, the human capital part and the physical capital part. But it's hard to think about, just conceptually to think about. It's hard to think about more human, well, maybe more human capital, more training, having diminishing returns. Probably at least linear. Yeah. Right. Maybe, but I don't. But it's hard. It's hard. That's harder to think about. That's the point. At the end of the day, that's the point. Are there diminishing returns? The question you're asking about, the broader conceptual question, is by more investment in human capital, physical capital, infrastructure, are there diminishing returns to that, or is that something that leads to increasing returns? And that's the difference between moving along the curve versus shifting the curve, essentially. Can you keep so here's a different, it's not the same question, but it's a related question, is can a person could ask, can living standards continue to increase forever? We can answer that with our model. We can answer that when we build it all. Like, yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, but you said, well, but there are some things that one has to think about, like, what about pollution? What about?
I was about to ask your opinion about the Malthusian limit for that question.
Yeah, exactly. So what about pollution? What about degradation of the environment, et cetera? And so that's a question, right? That is a hypothesis, and that is a real worry, right? There is a real worry about that. Then the question is, does technology ever overcome that sort of thing? Are there limits to growth, right? That is an age-old question, right? And we certainly aren't in the Malthusian kind of trap, but that was more about the population growth, right? But so there's a real question about about so scientifically, right? There are questions that impinge on that, and the answer might be there are limits. We don't fully know that, and that's not having to do with denying science. Something that affects the opposite. That's a scientific question. Then are there things that we haven't figured out yet, or haven't created yet, that allow us to produce stuff and do things that without adding pollution that imperils um, the world economy. Yeah. And then the question is, well, so what if another question is, so what if we just don't, what if we don't just keep to thinking about Earth? Like, what if we have Mars? What if we go to Mars? What if we go to the moon? Like, I don't know. Yeah, seems kind of crazy, right? But does that lead to further economic growth? And what does that mean? And kind of interesting questions. So yeah, maybe there are diminishing returns, and we might be at the point. In the question, one of the questions for climate change is is there an issue? Is there a tipping point? Right? Some of the models that most models kind of get at that point. Like, yeah, is there a point of no return? I don't know. It's a question of whether just like in economics, how 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 well can those models explain something that hasn't been invented yet or not? So I don't have any doubt about the models in terms of what we know right now, but will the models change over time? I don't know. I think we need to we need to seriously consider those things, though. Yeah, we do. Right. So I don't know the answer to that. Can we grow forever? Or are there ways to grow real GDP that don't have to do with goods, but do with services, for example, right? That don't necessarily create more pollution, et cetera, et cetera. Right. No. And there's a whole different question of, is real GDP what we want to be using to measure quality of life? There's a whole nother literature about that as well within economics. Right? People have alternative measures of things that matter for quality of life beyond real GDP. So, yeah, but our models can at least help us analyze these questions and raise new areas for inquiry and research, right, to help us get better answers. At the end of the day, that's what it's about. This course really is about, for me, is really about building students' analytical skills and polishing those analytical skills. And because that's, well, I mean, just because it's important, but if I was pragmatic about it, those are the skills that earn you the money. So if you want to say, show me the money, these are the skills that firms want. They want analytical skills of that problem solving skills, skills to break down complex things into simpler pieces that can be analyzed to help make better decisions, business decisions, for example. All right. Those aren't always right, because we always have to compare it back to reality. And if the projections aren't right, then you gotta modify your model and modify your analysis. That's what we do here. That's what that's what economists do. So this is building those skills over and over and over again. Another part of it has to do with being able to understand the real economy. And so if I had a pragmatic example, if you were sitting across the table from a recruiter and it came to A&T and the recruiter says, like, hey, I see you're an economics major. So tell me what's going to happen in the US economy over the next 6 months. You should be able to answer that question, like, without much pause. by the end of this course, you should be able to answer that question and have a really, and be able to just kind of rattle that off. Not because you know all the data about that too, but that you can think it through in terms of the model in what's likely to happen. That's the way economists think about that. So yeah, my goal is to get you to be able to break things down into simpler things, because there's too much information to take in about the whole economy at once. That's why we use models to try and break that down into smaller pieces that we can say something about. But that's all changing as well with machine learning and AI as well, big data. But conceptually, the concepts are still going to be the same. So yeah, the analytical skills are hold on, let me okay. The analytical skills from going through the process of analysis are that's redundant, but that's where you get the money. That's what separates econ majors from other majors, except maybe engineers. Engineers do that too. But yeah, we can talk about that as we go along too. All right. Some of the bigger pictures. Anything else before we break off? All right. So you got your work for next week, chapters 2 and 3, and all the document camera on, and we're gonna. So graphs are the language. You need to be able to be translators, right? So economics is also about learning a language, and graphs are part of that vocabulary. We could do it all. We could do it all calculus. We could do it all math based too. We could do all the equations, and you do that. Do that more in intermediate micro. We could do that in here too, but we've chosen not to do it this course that way. But it is graph intensive, right? So translating words to graphs, back to words. That's the key thing. So the mantra you'll hear from me all the time as we go through this, and you'll be able to just recite it. I can give you an example from the real world, and you should say, which market, which curve, which way, what happens? That's the deal. That's the whole process. That's the deal. Over and over and over again. Which market, which curve, which way, what happens? As a way to explain some real world event. Okay. If you can sort of get in that mindset, that'll be really, really helpful.